Oliver Bisazza, thank you very much for joining us here on the Corona Chat. For those
Thanks,
of you
Elena.
who don't know, for those of the people out there who don't know who you are you and what do you do?
So yeah, thanks, Elena. My name's Oliver Bisazza. I'm Director of Regulations and Industrial Policy at MedTech Europe. And MedTech Europe is the main industry association representing manufacturers of medical technologies, both medical devices and IVDs. So we are the main industry voice who represents these manufacturers and their needs towards the European stakeholders like the European institutions, as well as patient, physician, and notified body groups as well.
Okay, excellent. Lovely to have you here. So how has COVID-19 impacted you and your members, especially in particular the regulatory area for medical technology in Europe?
Right. Well, COVID-19 has had a huge impact, of course. Just like most other industries, people are these days working primarily out of home. A lot of sites have shut down unless they're super critical, and that just has an impact on daily life. But the sector as a whole has been very impacted in the sense that a lot of non-essential medical procedures have been slowed down or deferred entirely. But on the other hand, you've had this enormous, unprecedented demand for certain types of medtech solutions. Like on the medical devices side, a lot of demand for ventilators and protective equipment, and also on the diagnostic side, a huge need for new innovative tests that can help us diagnose COVID-19 and also check the immunity status of people to try and get us out of these lockdowns and start moving towards recovery. So that's happened all very, very quickly. And it means that many companies are having to quickly reorient how they organize themselves, ramp up production as much as they can of certain types of devices, while all the other stuff is kind of on pause for a while. Now, how does that affect the regulatory function? Well, it's very interesting. I mean, just like everyone else, I mean, our laser focus right now is on helping Europe combat this outbreak and recover from this outbreak and get back to something like normality as quickly as possible. We still obviously implement the two regulations, the IVDR and medical device regulation, as quickly and as efficiently as we can. But the reality is there has been considerable disruption. There's been disruption, for instance, in many clinical studies that people had ongoing, because most medical procedures, again, are deferred unless they're directly related to this virus. That has an impact, obviously, if your clinical study was in process and you need it to finish before you can file with a notified body. There have also been disruptions to the notified bodies themselves, with some of them postponing audits or canceling them altogether because they can't physically travel to the manufacturing sites, or it's not safe to let them in. That has an impact. There's also fears from some manufacturers whose notified body's not designated yet that the timeline for their designation is going to be postponed as well. And I guess the final thing I would say is that, yeah, for those manufacturers who are significantly ramping up production, they're scrambling to find as many of the raw materials and components as they can. And that means sometimes shifting around between different suppliers and different supply chains. And it can mean actually notifying a lot of changes to how they operate to their notified bodies. And all of this requires work from the regulatory function, time and capacity they want to be spending on implementing the regulations. So it's important work. We're prioritizing it. But the reality is that it is what's the word? It's kind of superseded everything else that was coming before.
Of course, and I think obviously, as you said, kind of like until this moment, the focus for a lot of medtech companies have been, from a regulatory perspective at least, implementing and getting ready for date of application for these new, in particular for the MDR that was supposed to be coming in May of this year, and obviously in the midst of all of this going on, we've seen a postponement to the date of application. So why was it requested in your mind, and what positive impacts can it actually bring?
Yeah, we were one of the groups requesting this back in March for some of the reasons I've just mentioned, the fact that this outbreak has so severely disrupted life. I mean, not just to us and notified bodies, let me be clear, even the authorities themselves, the people we work with in the European Commission and the national competent authorities, they too are undergoing lots of changes. They too are prioritizing the fight against COVID-19, as they should do. And that means that implementation work on their end is also, unfortunately, slowed down right now. I think that was recognized, to be very honest with you. I think it was also recognized that Europe should do all it can to avoid creating more shortages of medical devices or exacerbating existing shortages. We
Mm.
all know very well just a couple months ago and still now, there have been real challenges to get enough critical things like ventilators, face masks, and gloves to the people who need them. And so deferring the date of application for the MDR is just one of many, many measures that Europe has been trying to take to remove barriers and get these critical equipment to the healthcare workers and patients as quickly as they can. There have been measures on the procurement side, there have been measures on the supply chain side. Deferring MDR was one of the things they've done on the regulatory side. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it was the right move.
For sure. I think it's allowed also industry to kind of breathe a sigh of relief, of course, considering the situation that's ongoing and the strain on resources.
It's true. It does, of course, also have many, many other advantages that people should now leverage fully, because by deferring the date of application for 1 year, what that has meant is that in principle, at least, the former directives are still with us for one more year as well. When the MDR was going to come in this month, that was also going to fully replace, if you like, the MDD and the active implantables directive. So those two directives are still with us for another year now, and that means lots of things. Actually, it means, in principle, you can continue to work with the 56 notified bodies who are designated under the directives, if they will accept to keep doing directive work. It means, for instance, if you were a manufacturer exposed to what's it called, Swixit, the Swiss European
Yeah.
mutual recognition agreements, and you had some exposure to that, you've got more time to address that particular situation. It also means that the European institutions and the member states and the Commission can also, we hope, spend these extra 12 months correcting, if you like, some of the lacking MDR infrastructure we've been talking about so much. So publishing more guidance documents, designating more notified bodies, getting those expert panels up and running, and pushing forward with that, with the famous Elemed database. And this extra year gives opportunities across the board for us to get the MDR into a better shape than it was.
Definitely. And I guess kind of like the next question then, there's different schools of thoughts on this, but what about IVDR? Because obviously they postponed the date of application for MDR, but nothing was said about IVDR. What are your thoughts? Should that be?
Very good question. I mean, we made the request to be clear for both regulations. These regulations have always been like a brother and sister. They were developed together. They're implemented by the same regulatory authorities by and large. And it was very deliberate when the regulations were adopted that there should be this 2-year gap between the MDR deadline and the IVDR deadline. With the MDR deferment happening now, you've only got a 1-year gap, and we think that's not enough. There needs to be more relief for the IVD implementation as well, for similar reasons. I mean, it was no secret to anyone in this business that IVDR had been a little bit neglected by the Commission of Member States. I mean, there has been some work to implement that regulation, but the progress has been pretty glacial so far, even before COVID-19. We've got, 2 notified bodies only, unless you count BSI twice. We've got a few guidance documents which are relevant for both sectors, but if you think about it, we don't have a single guidance document yet from the authorities which is specific to IVDs. We've got lots which are specific for MDs, or which apply to both, but nothing yet for IVDs. And that just goes to show that how much the IVD sector has had to wait for the MDR to be implemented fully too. So that's one of the reasons. And let's face it, COVID-19 has also had many of those impacts we just said on the IVD sector as well. Many IVD developers, whether they were early on into it or they've come a bit later, they're all trying to come out now with COVID-19 tests to diagnose or to check for immunity. And that's because the world is screaming out for them. And so yeah, it's a little bit the same story. We are trying to respond as a sector to the requests and needs of society, and prioritizing the manufacturing of these tests. We keep doing IVDR implementation as best we can, but the reality is the focus is on fighting COVID-19. And it's just obvious to us that the whole sector, industry, authorities, notified bodies are all going to need more time. It's going to be very obvious in the next year or two. But yeah, the opportunity to defer both regulations has not yet been taken, as we all know.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a cool call to action to anybody that's listening to this. If you agree and you think that, you know, with the IVDR, you know, that there's a need for the IVDR to also be deferred, write your comments below, give this video a like so that we can also see what your thoughts are. Oliver, thank you so much. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you,
to
Elena.
be with you. Lovely to see your perspectives, and thanks for sharing, you know, that MedTech Europe point of view. Have a lovely weekend.
You too, Elena. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure.